Hey guys, tonight we begin with something unexpectedly soft, strangely tender, and utterly removed from the thundering rallies and blood-soaked battlefields. We're diving into Adolf Hitler's secret passion for architecture, a fixation so consuming it shaped not just his ambitions but his entire identity, long before tanks rolled and empires fell. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Adolf Hitler, the images that surface are inevitably dark. Military parades, twisted ideology, the machinery of war. But there exists another Hitler, one who spent hours bent over drafting tables, sketching columns and domes with the meticulous care of a man designing cathedrals instead of campaigns. This was the Hitler who dreamed not of conquest but of monuments, not of destruction but of creation. And that obsession, that architectural fever, burned inside him long before politics ever entered the picture. It began in a place far removed from Berlin's power corridors, Linz, Austria, a modest provincial city nestled along the Danube River. Young Adolf grew up here in the late 1800s, the son of a stern customs official and a doting mother. His childhood was unremarkable in most ways. Mediocre grades, strained relationships with authority figures, and a profound sense of not quite fitting in anywhere. But there was one thing that captivated him completely: buildings. He would wander through Linz for hours, sketching facades in cheap notebooks, studying the way light fell across stone, memorising the proportions of every public building he encountered. The Opera House particularly mesmerised him. Its neo-Baroque grandeur, its columns rising like frozen music, the way it commanded attention without shouting. To young Hitler, architecture wasn't just construction. It was frozen power, permanence carved into the landscape, a way for individuals to outlive their fragile mortal shells. His father wanted him to become a civil servant, respectable, stable, forgettable. But Hitler had other plans. At 16, after his father's death, he convinced his mother to let him pursue art. Not painting, not yet, but architecture. He devoured books on classical design, Renaissance palaces, and the monumental works of ancient Rome. Rome, especially Rome. The city obsessed him. Its forums, its arches, its unapologetic declaration of imperial might through marble and stone. Rome didn't whisper. Rome roared, and Hitler wanted to roar too. In 1907, at 18, he applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Twice. Both times he was rejected. The examiners noted his drawings were technically competent but lacked life, emotion, humanity. His sketches of buildings were rigid, cold, perfect in their proportions but soulless. They told him he might have more success in architecture school, but there was a problem. To study architecture formally, he needed a secondary school diploma, something his erratic education had never produced. The door slammed shut. What followed were the most formative and perhaps most bitter years of Hitler's life. He drifted through Vienna, a city of imperial grandeur and crushing poverty existing side by side. He lived in flop houses, sold postcard paintings for pennies, and spent his days wandering the Ringstrasse, Vienna's grand boulevard lined with monumental public buildings. The parliament, the opera, the museums, all built in styles meant to evoke ancient glory. Vienna was a city obsessed with its own magnificence, and Hitler absorbed every stone of it. But he also absorbed resentment. Vienna was diverse, cosmopolitan, filled with Jews, Slavs, Hungarians, a melting pot that to Hitler felt chaotic, impure, threatening. His rejection from the academy festered. He blamed the examiners, the system, the city itself. And somewhere in those bitter years, his love of architecture became tangled with something darker, a belief that greatness was being stolen from him, that the world owed him recognition, that his vision, his designs, his dreams deserved to reshape reality. He sketched obsessively, Theatres, bridges, triumphal arches, grand boulevards. Not for clients, not for money, just for himself. These drawings were his escape, his fantasy world where he wasn't a failed artist sleeping in homeless shelters, but a visionary architect commanding marble and stone. Architecture became his refuge, the one place where he felt in control, where his will could impose order on chaos. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hitler enlisted immediately, not out of patriotism for Austria. He despised Austria, but for Germany. He saw the war as a cleansing fire, a chance to prove himself, to escape the humiliation of Vienna, and for 4 years he served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front. He was decorated for bravery, wounded twice, and by all accounts strangely content. The trenches gave him purpose, structure, belonging. Things architecture once promised but failed to deliver. But even in the trenches, even surrounded by mud and death, Hitler sketched. Bunkers, fortifications, imagined monuments. Fellow soldiers recalled him drawing compulsively in stolen moments, his hands black with charcoal, his eyes distant. He wasn't sketching what he saw, he was sketching what should be. And when Germany surrendered in 1918, when the empire collapsed and chaos consumed the nation, Hitler felt that old familiar rage return. The world had rejected him again. He drifted back to Munich, a city in turmoil, teetering between revolution and reaction. He had no trade, no prospects, no future. But he had rage, and he had dreams. Dreams of rebuilding Germany, not just politically, but physically. Dreams of erasing the shame of defeat with monuments so grand they would silence doubt. Dreams of cities transformed into eternal testaments of power. And slowly, almost accidentally, he discovered he had a gift. Not for drawing, but for speaking. In smoky beer halls, he began addressing small crowds of disaffected veterans and angry workers. His speeches were raw, furious, hypnotic. He spoke of betrayal, of resurrection, of a Germany that would rise from humiliation to glory. And buried within those rants, always, was architecture. He promised not just political renewal, but physical transformation. New buildings, new cities, a new aesthetic to match a new age. His audiences didn't fully understand, but they felt it. This man wasn't just angry, he had a vision. By the early 1920s, Hitler had found his calling. Not as an architect, but as a politician wielding architectural dreams like weapons. He spoke of Berlin transformed into a world capital that would dwarf Paris, London, Rome. He sketched his visions on napkins during party meetings, grand domes, colossal avenues, monuments that would last 1,000 years. His followers dismissed it as rhetoric. They had no idea he was deadly serious. But politics was a means, never the end. The end was always buildings. Buildings that would make people feel small, obedient, awed. Buildings that would outlive him, outlive everyone, eternal proof that his vision had remade the world. And as he rose through the chaos of Weimar Germany, as his party grew from a fringe movement to a national force, he never stopped sketching, never stopped dreaming in stone. Because for Adolf Hitler, architecture wasn't a hobby. It was his first love, his deepest obsession, the thing that defined him long before swastikas and speeches. And when he finally seized power in 1933, when all of Germany lay before him like a blank canvas, he didn't reach first for tanks or laws. He reached for blueprints. Because the man who failed to enter architecture school was about to redesign an entire nation, and the world would never be the same. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 should have been consumed entirely by politics, consolidation, the brutal machinery of transforming a democracy into a dictatorship. Most leaders in his position would focus on military build-up, economic recovery, or silencing opposition. Hitler did all of those things, but almost immediately he also began obsessing over buildings. Not metaphorically, literally. Within weeks of becoming Chancellor, he was meeting with architects, sketching his visions and demanding plans for the physical transformation of Germany. It was as if 30 years of frustration, of being denied entry into Vienna's academy, of living in flop houses while staring at imperial monuments, had created a dam. And now, with absolute power in his hands, the dam burst. Hitler didn't just want to govern Germany, He wanted to sculpt it, reshape it, turn it into a three-dimensional manifestation of his ideology, frozen in stone and steel. His first target was predictable: Berlin. The capital was a sprawling, chaotic city, more functional than beautiful, more industrial than imperial. Hitler despised it. To him, Berlin lacked grandeur, lacked presence. It was a city that whispered when it should shout, and he intended to fix that. He envisioned Berlin not as the capital of Germany, but as the capital of the world, a city so overwhelming in scale and beauty that visitors would be struck dumb with awe. He called it Germania. Not a redesign of Berlin, but a replacement, a total reinvention. At its heart would be a grand boulevard, wider than the Champs-Élysées, longer than any avenue in existence. This boulevard would stretch for miles, lined with monuments, government buildings, museums, theatres, all designed in a neoclassical style meant to echo ancient Rome while surpassing it in scale. And at the northern end of this boulevard, dominating the skyline, would rise the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. The Volkshalle was Hitler's obsession within an obsession. He sketched it countless times, refining proportions, adjusting details. It was to be a domed structure so colossal it would dwarf St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The dome alone would span over 800 feet in diameter, large enough to fit St. Peter's entire structure inside it. It would hold 180,000 people, not seated but standing, a human ocean gathered beneath a ceiling so high it would create its own weather. Clouds, they said, might form inside the dome on humid days. This wasn't architecture for human comfort. This was architecture as domination. Standing inside the Volkshalle, an individual would feel infinitesimally small, insignificant, crushed beneath the weight of the state's grandeur. And that was precisely the point. Hitler wanted buildings that made people feel their own smallness, that reminded them they were tiny parts of a vast eternal machine. He wanted architecture that functioned as propaganda, silent but overwhelming. But Germania wasn't just about the Volkshalle. There would be a triumphal arch, taller than the Arc de Triomphe, inscribed with the names of Germany's World War I dead. A palace for the Führer himself, not modest but staggering in opulence, filled with marble, gold and art looted from across Europe. Museums to house the greatest cultural treasures of human history, all gathered in one place to prove Germany's supremacy. And a railway station so massive it would redefine what public infrastructure could be. Hitler pored over these plans obsessively. He held late-night meetings with architects, sometimes until dawn, discussing column widths, facade materials, the exact angle of sunlight on marble steps. He carried blueprints with him constantly, unrolling them during military briefings, annoying generals who wanted to discuss troop movements, while he debated the merits of granite versus limestone. To those around him, it sometimes seemed like he cared more about buildings than battles, and perhaps in a way he did. Because battles were temporary, victories could be reversed, empires rose and fell. But buildings lasted. They outlived kings, generals, entire civilizations. Architecture was immortality, and Hitler, terrified of being forgotten, wanted his immortality carved in stone. He understood something fundamental about power, that symbols matter as much as force, that a grand monument can inspire loyalty more effectively than 1,000 speeches. The Nazis didn't just want to control Germany. They wanted to define it, to make their ideology inseparable from the physical landscape, so that even if the regime fell, the buildings would remain silent testaments to their vision. But there was a problem. Building Germania would require resources, labour, time, and by the mid-1930s Hitler's ambitions were already pulling Germany in multiple directions. Rearmament consumed steel and concrete. Autobahn construction demanded workers. The economy, though recovering, remained fragile. Yet Hitler refused to scale back his architectural dreams. He insisted Germania would proceed regardless of cost, regardless of war, regardless of reality. He appointed Albert Speer, a young architect with a talent for monumental design and an eagerness to please as his chief architect. Speer was brilliant, ambitious, and willing to ignore inconvenient truths like physics, budgets, and human suffering. Together, Hitler and Speer became a creative partnership built on shared megalomania. They spent hours discussing aesthetics, materials, lighting. Hitler would sketch rough ideas, Speer would refine them into technical drawings, and both would lose themselves in fantasies of eternal stone empires. But even as they sketched, even as models of Germania were built and displayed, reality intruded. War was coming. Hitler's territorial ambitions in Europe, his desire to reclaim lost lands and expand German living space, would soon consume everything. Yet even as armies mobilized, even as invasion plans were drawn, Hitler never abandoned Germania. He kept the models in his office, kept the blueprints on his desk, kept insisting that after the war, after victory, construction would resume. The world capital would rise. It never did. But for years, Hitler believed it would. He believed so deeply that even as Berlin burned, even as Soviet tanks closed in, he still spoke of rebuilding, still spoke of the monuments that would rise from the rubble. Because for Hitler, architecture wasn't just an obsession, it was a promise he made to himself, a promise that his vision, his will, his dreams would outlast death itself. And in the end, that obsession revealed something essential about the man. He wasn't content with conquering nations. He wanted to conquer time, to build so grandly that 1,000 years from now, people would look upon his works and know his name. It was ambition on a scale so vast it bordered on madness, and it consumed him, quietly, relentlessly, until the very end. While Germania remained Hitler's grandest fantasy, it was far from his only architectural fixation. He saw all of Germany as a canvas, every city an opportunity to impose his vision, and he approached this task with the fervour of a man rewriting history one building at a time. Existing structures that didn't fit his aesthetic were dismissed as weak, degenerate, unworthy. In their place would rise monuments designed to last millennia, echoing the grandeur of Rome and the power of ancient empires. One of his earliest targets was Munich, the city where his political movement had been born. Munich held a special place in Hitler's heart. It was here, in smoky beer halls and rowdy rallies, that the Nazi Party had grown from a fringe group into a national force. And Hitler wanted Munich to reflect that significance. He envisioned it as the spiritual capital of the movement, a city transformed into a living shrine to National Socialism. He commissioned the construction of grand party buildings, temples to ideology disguised as civic architecture. The Führerbau, his personal office in Munich, was designed in stark neoclassical style, all clean lines and imposing columns. Nearby rose the administrative building of the Nazi Party, equally grand, equally cold. These weren't merely office spaces, they were statements, physical manifestations of authority meant to intimidate visitors before a single word was spoken. But Hitler's vision extended beyond government buildings. He wanted Munich to host monumental public spaces where the masses could gather, where rallies could unfold beneath towering structures that made individuals feel like drops in an ocean. The Königsplatz, a large square in the heart of Munich, was redesigned entirely. Ancient museums were renovated. New temples, quite literally temples, were built to house the remains of Nazis killed during the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. These martyrs were enshrined like saints, their eternal flame tended by guards in crisp uniforms, the architecture deliberately invoking ancient Greece and Rome to link Hitler's movement with the glories of antiquity. Then there was Nuremberg, a medieval city with narrow streets and half-timbered houses. Hitler saw it as the perfect stage for his most theatrical displays of power. Every year, the Nazi Party held its rallies here, and Hitler wanted the city's architecture to match the scale of these events. He commissioned the construction of the Zeppelinfeld, a massive parade ground flanked by towering stone tribunes. Here, hundreds of thousands gathered to hear Hitler speak, surrounded by banners, torches, and architecture designed to overwhelm the senses. The centrepiece of Nuremberg's transformation was to be the Deutsches Stadion, a stadium so large it would hold 400,000 spectators, not 40,000, not 100,000, 400,000. It would be the largest stadium ever built, dwarfing anything ancient Rome had conceived. Hitler sketched it repeatedly, obsessing over sightlines, acoustics, the exact dimensions needed to ensure every person inside felt simultaneously part of a collective and utterly insignificant before the state's grandeur. But building these monuments required more than vision. It required labour, vast quantities of it. And as the 1930s progressed, as Hitler's ambitions grew more extreme, the source of that labour became darker. Concentration camp prisoners were increasingly used for construction projects, worked to exhaustion, often to death, to erect the monuments Hitler dreamed of. Stone quarries near camps like Mauthausen supplied granite for grand buildings, each block stained with the suffering of those forced to extract it. Hitler never acknowledged this. To him, the suffering was irrelevant, invisible, a necessary cost buried beneath layers of aesthetic beauty. He walked through scale models of his cities, pointing at miniature buildings, imagining sunlight on marble, envisioning crowds gathering in awe. The human cost never entered his calculations. Architecture was eternal, people were temporary, and this mindset extended to his views on urban planning. Hitler despised clutter, diversity, the organic chaos that made cities feel alive. He wanted order, symmetry, control. Streets should run straight as arrows. Buildings should align in perfect rows. Public spaces should be vast, empty, ready to be filled with regimented masses. There was no room for spontaneity, no tolerance for disorder. His cities would function like machines, beautiful perhaps, but cold, designed to crush individuality beneath collective grandeur. He also had peculiar obsessions with specific architectural details. He hated flat roofs, considering them modernist degeneracy. He insisted on pitched roofs, traditional forms that evoked a mythic Germanic past. He despised glass facades, which he saw as weak, transparent, too revealing. He preferred stone, granite, marble, materials that promised permanence, and he loathed colour. His cities were to be built in shades of grey, white, black. Monochrome monuments to power, stripped of warmth, humanity, joy. Yet for all his rigidity, Hitler remained personally engaged in every detail. He studied architectural history obsessively, memorising the dimensions of famous buildings, comparing ancient Roman structures to his planned monuments, always asking whether his designs were larger, grander, more imposing. He wanted to surpass history, to build so magnificently that future generations would forget Athens, Rome, Paris, and remember only Berlin, only Germania, only his vision. And he genuinely believed this was possible, believed it with the fervour of a fanatic. In his mind, architecture wasn't vanity, it was destiny. He saw himself not as a dictator, but as a builder, a creator, a man reshaping the physical world to match his inner vision. And if that required suffering, if it required war, if it required the destruction of entire populations, well, that was simply the price of greatness. As the 1930s wore on, as Germany rearmed and Europe edged toward catastrophe, Hitler continued sketching, continued planning, continued believing that his buildings would rise, that his cities would dominate the world, that his name would be carved into history not through conquest, but through stone. It was an obsession so consuming it blurred the line between ambition and madness, and it never ever let him go. But architecture wasn't just about grand monuments and city planning for Hitler. It was also deeply personal, a reflection of his private tastes, his insecurities, his need for control even in the smallest details. And nowhere was this more evident than in his residences, the spaces he designed or redesigned to reflect his vision of how a leader should live. The most famous of these was the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. Originally a modest chalet, Hitler purchased it in the 1920s with money earned from Mein Kampf sales. But modest was never enough. Over the years he expanded it repeatedly, transforming a simple mountain house into a sprawling complex complete with terraces, conference rooms, and a massive picture window that offered panoramic views of the Alps. That window was Hitler's pride. It was enormous, one of the largest single-pane windows ever constructed at the time, and it could be lowered into the floor at the push of a button, dissolving the barrier between interior and exterior. Hitler would sit for hours staring at the mountains, drawing inspiration from their permanence, their indifference to human affairs. He saw in those peaks the same qualities he wanted for his buildings: eternal, immovable, sublime. But the Berghof wasn't just a retreat. It was a stage. Hitler hosted foreign dignitaries here, using the setting to project power. Visitors would arrive after a long, winding drive through the mountains, already disoriented, already impressed. They would enter the house and be confronted with that massive window, the Alps towering beyond, Hitler silhouetted against nature's grandeur. It was theatre, carefully designed to make guests feel small, off balance, awed before a single word was exchanged. Inside, the decor was surprisingly traditional. Heavy furniture, dark wood, tapestries, fireplaces large enough to walk into. Hitler despised modernism in all its forms, calling it decadent, cold, un-German. He preferred styles that evoked a mythic past, an imagined era when Germany was pure, strong, united. His homes reflected this nostalgia, filled with artifacts and art that reinforced his vision of Germanic greatness. Yet there were contradictions. Despite his love of traditional aesthetics, Hitler embraced modern technology when it suited him. The Berghof had state-of-the-art heating systems, advanced telecommunications equipment, even a private cinema where Hitler watched films, late into the night. He saw no tension here. Technology served his comfort, but aesthetics shaped his identity. Hitler also maintained a residence in Berlin, a chancellery that he found inadequate and eventually replaced. The old Reich chancellery was too small, too modest, too associated with the Weimar Republic he despised. So he commissioned Albert Speer to design a new one, and the result was staggering. The new Reich chancellery, completed in 1939, was a monument to intimidation. Visitors entered through massive bronze doors and found themselves in a gallery 480 feet long, twice the length of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The floors were polished marble, the ceilings soared, and every surface gleamed with expensive materials. The purpose was obvious: to overwhelm, to make anyone walking that corridor feel insignificant by the time they reached Hitler's office. And Hitler's office itself was enormous, deliberately oversized. His desk sat at the far end, positioned so that visitors had to walk the entire length of the room while Hitler watched, evaluating, judging. It was a power play disguised as interior design, and it worked. Diplomats and generals reported feeling unnerved before meetings even began, the architecture doing half of Hitler's work for him. Yet despite all this grandeur, Hitler remained oddly detached from luxury in some ways. He didn't drink alcohol, rarely smoked, ate simple meals, and kept irregular hours. His personal habits were ascetic, almost monkish. But his spaces, his buildings, these had to be grand. It was as if he poured all the excess, all the indulgence he denied himself personally, into the architecture around him. The buildings lived the life he wouldn't allow himself. This extended to his vision for post-war Germany. He planned not just public monuments, but entire residential districts designed to house the new elite, the racially pure families who would inherit his 1,000-year Reich. These homes would be large, traditional, surrounded by gardens, and built to last centuries. He imagined neighbourhoods where every house looked similar, where conformity was architectural, where even private life was regimented, designed, controlled. Hitler's obsession with residential architecture also revealed his paternalism. He saw himself as a father figure to the German people, and like a stern father, he believed he knew best how they should live. He dictated housing designs, approved urban plans, and micromanaged details that most leaders would never consider. It wasn't enough to rule Germany politically. He wanted to shape the physical environment of every citizen's life, to ensure that even in their homes, they were surrounded by his vision. And he genuinely believed this was for their benefit. In his mind, architectural beauty uplifted the spirit, inspired loyalty, created better citizens. Ugly, chaotic cities bred weakness and degeneracy. Clean, orderly, monumental cities bred strength and unity. Architecture wasn't decoration. It was social engineering, a tool to mould the population into the image he desired. But there was something deeply sad beneath all this control. A man who failed to gain entry into art school, who spent years in poverty sketching buildings he'd never designed, was now forcing an entire nation to live inside his unfulfilled dreams. Every monument, every grand boulevard, every oversized window was a compensation, an attempt to prove to himself and the world that he had been right all along. that his vision was worthy, that he deserved recognition as a great builder. In the end, Hitler's private architectural obsessions revealed a man desperately seeking validation through permanence. He couldn't control how people remembered him, but he could control what they saw. And if those buildings stood long enough, if they dominated skylines and inspired awe, maybe, just maybe, his name would endure. Not as a tyrant, not as a murderer, but as a builder, a creator, an architect of a new world, frozen in stone. As Hitler's power solidified and his architectural ambitions expanded, he needed someone to translate his sketches and fantasies into reality. Enter Albert Speer, a young architect whose talent, ambition and willingness to serve would make him the most important figure in Nazi architecture, and eventually one of the most complicated figures in the entire regime. Speer was born in 1905 into a wealthy family in Mannheim, Germany. He studied architecture in Munich and Berlin, absorbing the classical traditions that dominated German architectural education. But he also encountered modernism, the sleek, functional designs emerging from the Bauhaus movement. Speer flirted with these ideas briefly, but ultimately rejected them, drawn instead to the monumental neoclassicism that Hitler adored. Their meeting was almost accidental. In 1930, Speer attended a Nazi rally out of curiosity. He wasn't particularly political, but something about Hitler's rhetoric captivated him. When he heard Hitler speak about rebuilding Germany, about creating monuments that would last 1,000 years, Speer felt a thrill. Here was a leader who understood architecture's power, who saw buildings not as shelters, but as statements. Speer joined the Nazi Party soon after. His rise was meteoric. In 1933, shortly after Hitler became Chancellor, Speer was commissioned to redesign a building for Joseph Goebbels. The work impressed Nazi officials, and soon Speer found himself designing stages for rallies, facades for party buildings, and eventually the interiors of Hitler's new chancellery. With each project, Speer demonstrated not just technical skill, but an intuitive understanding of what Hitler wanted: grandeur, intimidation, timelessness. Hitler was delighted. He had finally found an architect who didn't resist his wildest ideas, who didn't lecture him about budgets or feasibility, who simply said yes and made it happen. Speer, for his part, was intoxicated by the access, the resources, the opportunity. He was still in his 20s, yet he was designing buildings for the leader of Germany, shaping the physical landscape of an entire nation. By 1937, Hitler appointed Speer as General Building Inspector for the Reich capital, effectively making him responsible for the transformation of Berlin into Germania. It was an astonishing level of trust and authority for someone so young, but Hitler saw in Speer a reflection of his own frustrated ambitions. Speer was the architect Hitler had dreamed of becoming, and in many ways Speer became Hitler's architectural alter ego, the hands that built what Hitler's mind imagined. Together, they spent countless hours reviewing plans, building models, discussing materials. Hitler would sketch rough ideas on napkins, and Speer would refine them into technical drawings. They debated column widths, debated the exact shade of marble, debated whether a dome should rise 700 or 800 feet. These weren't casual conversations. They were obsessive, granular, exhausting. Speer later admitted that Hitler often knew more about specific architectural details than he did, that the Führer had memorized the dimensions of ancient monuments and constantly compared them to his own designs. But the partnership went deeper than aesthetics. Hitler trusted Speer in ways he trusted few others. Speer was political enough not to threaten him, talented enough to be indispensable, and deferential enough to never challenge his authority. And Speer, intoxicated by power and access, never questioned the moral implications of what he was building. He saw only the opportunity, the chance to create monuments that would define an era. The models they created were astonishing. Massive, detailed replicas of entire city districts, complete with miniature trees, streetlights, and tiny human figures to provide scale. These models filled entire rooms, and Hitler would spend hours walking around them, bending down to examine individual buildings, imagining himself strolling through the completed city. For him, these models weren't hypothetical. They were previews of inevitability. Speer designed the new chancellery, the Zeppelinfeld in Nuremberg, and countless other structures. But his masterpiece, The one Hitler cared about most was the Great Hall, the Volkshalle. Speer refined Hitler's rough sketches into a structure that was technically feasible, at least on paper. He calculated load-bearing requirements, designed the dome support system, and planned how such a colossal building could be heated, ventilated, and lit. The Volkshalle was to be the centrepiece of Germania, visible from miles away, dominating the skyline like a second sun. Inside, the scale would be inhuman. The dome's interior would rise 726 feet, taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The oculus at its peak would be large enough to fit a 5-story building through it. And the acoustics would be so strange that speakers would need amplification, systems to ensure their voices reached the back rows. But there were problems. Engineers quietly worried that the structure's weight would cause it to sink into Berlin's marshy ground. Others questioned whether the dome could even be heated efficiently. On cold days, condensation might create rain inside the building. Literally a building so large it would have its own weather. Speer presented solutions, though he privately harboured doubts. But Hitler didn't want to hear about problems. He wanted to hear about progress. And progress there was, at least on paper. By the late 1930s, Germania existed as thousands of blueprints, hundreds of models, and millions of marks allocated to preliminary work. Land was cleared, buildings were demolished, granite was ordered from quarries. The project felt real, tangible, inevitable. Hitler spoke of dedicating the Volkshalle in 1950, a date he circled on calendars, a deadline he insisted would be met. But reality had other plans. As Germany rearmed, as war loomed, resources grew scarce. Steel and concrete were diverted to military projects. Labour shortages intensified. Still, Hitler refused to abandon Germania. Even as tensions with Poland escalated, even as Europe braced for conflict, he continued meeting with Speer, continued refining plans, continued insisting that after the war, after victory, construction would resume. Speer played along, perhaps because he believed it, perhaps because he didn't dare contradict the Führer. But as the years passed, as the war expanded and Germany's fortunes darkened, the dream of Germania faded. Not in Hitler's mind, never there, but in the realm of possibility. The models gathered dust, the blueprints yellowed, and the Grand Boulevard remained a muddy construction site, a scar across Berlin that would never heal. Yet even in the war's final years, even as Allied bombs rained down and Soviet tanks closed in, Hitler still spoke of rebuilding, still spoke of the day when Germania would rise from the ashes. Speer, by then Minister of Armaments, had moved on, focused on keeping Germany's war machine functioning. But Hitler hadn't. He clung to those blueprints like lifelines, like proof that his vision mattered, that he mattered, that his life had meaning beyond the destruction he had wrought. In the end, the partnership between Hitler and Speer produced almost nothing tangible. A few buildings, a few stages, a few facades, but it consumed them both. Speer would later claim he was apolitical, that he focused only on architecture, that he didn't know the full extent of the regime's atrocities. History judges that claim harshly, because architecture under the Nazis was never neutral. Every monument built required labour, often slave labour. Every grand design served propaganda. And Speer, whether he admitted it or not, was complicit. But for Hitler, architecture remained pure. It was the one part of his vision untainted by politics, by war, by genocide. It was the dream he, nurtured since childhood, the promise he made to himself when he was a failed artist sleeping in Viennese flophouses. And even as everything else crumbled, even as his empire burned, he held on to that dream. Because for Adolf Hitler, architecture wasn't just an obsession. It was the last proof that he had once been more than a monster, that he had once been a dreamer. If Berlin represented Hitler's vision for Germany's future, the city of Nuremberg embodied something different. The theatre of power, the stage where ideology transformed into spectacle, and architecture was the centrepiece of that transformation. Nuremberg wasn't just a city. Under Hitler it became a shrine, a pilgrimage site, a place where the masses gathered to witness the regime's carefully choreographed displays of strength. The Nazi Party rallies, held annually from 1933 to 1938, were monumental affairs. Hundreds of thousands of party members, soldiers and spectators descended upon Nuremberg for days of parades, speeches and ceremonies. But these weren't improvised gatherings. They were meticulously planned productions, and Hitler insisted that the architecture match the scale and drama of the events themselves. The centrepiece was the Zeppelinfeld, a parade ground designed by Albert Speer. It wasn't just large, it was overwhelming. The stone tribunes flanking the field could hold 200,000 people, packed shoulder to shoulder, facing a massive speaker's platform where Hitler would stand. Behind him rose a colonnade of pillars, stark and imposing, inspired by the Pergamon altar of ancient Greece. The message was clear. The Nazis were heirs to classical greatness, and their rallies were the modern equivalent of ancient rites. But Speer added something even more dramatic, the Cathedral of Light. During night rallies, 152 anti-aircraft searchlights were positioned around the perimeter of the field, their beams aimed straight into the sky. When activated, they created vertical columns of light so bright they could be seen from miles away, so tall they seemed to pierce the heavens. The effect was otherworldly, as if the rally were taking place inside a temple with walls made of light itself. Hitler loved it. He stood at the centre of this spectacle, bathed in light, surrounded by perfectly regimented formations of soldiers and party members, their torches flickering, their voices rising in unison. It was architecture and light and choreography blending into a single overwhelming experience designed to obliterate individuality and replace it with collective ecstasy. The rallies were also a showcase for Hitler's obsession with order and symmetry. Every formation was precise. Every banner hung at the exact same height. Every column of marchers moved in perfect synchronization. The architecture reinforced this aesthetic. Buildings in Nuremberg were stripped of ornamentation, reduced to clean lines and massive blocks of stone. There was no warmth, no whimsy, only power. But Nuremberg's transformation extended beyond rally grounds. Hitler planned an entire district dedicated to Nazi ideology. The Congress Hall, a massive structure designed to hold 50,000 people, was begun but never completed. It was modelled after the Colosseum, a direct nod to Rome, but larger, grander, more imposing. Hitler wanted it to host party congresses, vast indoor gatherings where ideology could be preached like gospel, in a space designed to make listeners feel both part of something greater and utterly insignificant. Then there was the German Stadium, Hitler's most audacious Nuremberg project. It was to be an arena for 400,000 spectators, built to host future Olympic Games that Hitler imagined Germany would dominate. The stadium's design was simple but overwhelming, a massive horseshoe of stone rising from the earth like an ancient ruin brought back to life. No modern amenities, no concessions to comfort, just raw, brutal scale. The foundation stone was laid in 1937 and excavation began. But as war approached, construction slowed, then stopped. The stadium was never completed, and today only the foundation remains. A scar in the earth. A reminder of ambitions too vast to realise. Hitler envisioned athletes competing beneath banners, crowds roaring in a stadium larger than any in history, Germany's dominance proven through sport and stone. Instead, the site became a monument to futility. Yet even incomplete, Nuremberg's Nazi architecture left a mark. After the war, the Allies debated what to do with these structures. Some wanted them demolished, erased, forgotten. Others argued they should remain as warnings, physical evidence of the regime's megalomania. In the end, most were left standing, empty, silent, slowly decaying. Walking through Nuremberg today, you can still feel it. The Zeppelinfeld, crumbling and overgrown, still radiates menace. The Congress Hall, incomplete and repurposed, still looms. These buildings were designed to last 1,000 years, and though they have stood for less than a century, they've already outlived the regime that built them. They remain, not as monuments to glory, but as reminders of how architecture can be weaponized, how stone and space can be manipulated to crush individuality and glorify power. Hitler saw Nuremberg as proof that his vision could be realized. For a few years it was. The rally succeeded in creating awe, in overwhelming the senses, in making participants feel part of something larger. but they also revealed the hollowness at the core of Nazi ideology. Strip away the lights, the choreography, the architecture, and what remained? Propaganda, empty grandeur, a spectacle with no substance. Still, Hitler never saw it that way. He genuinely believed Nuremberg represented the future, that these rallies would continue indefinitely, that the stadiums would host games for centuries. Even after the war began, even as resources dwindled, he refused to cancel the rallies permanently. He spoke of resuming them after victory, of completing the stadium, of filling it with cheering crowds. It was a fantasy, of course, but one he clung to desperately. Because Nuremberg, more than any other city, represented Hitler's belief that architecture could shape reality. That if the buildings were grand enough, the rituals impressive enough, the spectacle overwhelming enough, people would believe, would obey, would submit. And for a time, they did. Not because the ideology was compelling, but because the architecture was overpowering. In the end, Nuremberg became a graveyard of ambition. The unfinished stadium, the decaying rally grounds, the silent Congress Hall, all stood as monuments not to triumph but to hubris. Hitler had dreamed of building forever. Instead, he built ruins. And those ruins, more than any completed monument, tell the truth about his architectural obsession. It was grand, it was ambitious, and it was utterly, tragically hollow. While Hitler's most grandiose plans focused on Germania and Nuremberg, his architectural ambitions extended across the entire Reich. He envisioned a Germany dotted with monumental structures, each city transformed into a showcase of Nazi ideology and classical grandeur. No corner of the nation was too small, no town too insignificant to escape his redesign. Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi movement, held special significance. Hitler declared it the capital of the movement and planned extensive renovations. The city was to be filled with party buildings, museums and monuments celebrating Nazi history. The Königsplatz became a focal point, its ancient museums flanked by two new temples, the Honor Temples, built to house the remains of Nazis killed during the Beer Hall Putsch. These weren't metaphorical temples, they were literal neoclassical structures with open roofs, columns and eternal flames, transforming dead brown shirts into martyred saints. Hitler also planned a massive new train station for Munich, one that would dwarf the existing structure. It would serve as the gateway to the city, the first impression for visitors arriving to witness Nazi glory. The station's design emphasised horizontal lines and heavy stone, an aesthetic meant to convey permanence and power. Like so many projects, it was never built, but the plans remained on Hitler's desk, constantly revised, constantly refined. Hamburg, Germany's largest port city, was another target. Hitler wanted to transform it into a grand maritime capital, complete with monumental bridges spanning the Elbe River and a massive high-rise building that would dominate the skyline. This was unusual. Hitler generally despised tall buildings, seeing them as American and modern, but he made an exception for Hamburg. He envisioned a tower that would announce Germany's presence to ships arriving from across the world, a lighthouse of ideology visible for miles. Even smaller cities weren't spared. Linz, Hitler's childhood home in Austria, became an obsession in his later years. He planned to retire there after the war, and he wanted Linz transformed into a cultural capital rivaling Vienna. He sketched galleries, opera houses, libraries, and museums. He intended to fill these institutions with art looted from across Europe, creating a repository of culture in the modest city where he'd once wandered as a frustrated boy. The Linz project was deeply personal. It represented a return, a vindication. The boy who had failed in Vienna, who had been rejected and humiliated, would return home in triumph, bringing with him the greatest treasures of Western civilization. He would turn Linz into the cultural heart of the Reich, and in doing so, prove to everyone, including himself, that he had been right all along. But Hitler's architectural vision extended beyond individual cities. He wanted a network of autobahns, high-speed highways connecting every corner of Germany. These weren't just practical infrastructure, they were monuments in their own right. Smooth ribbons of concrete cutting through forests and mountains, symbols of modernity and efficiency. Hitler often inspected autobahn construction sites personally. examining the quality of the paving, the design of the bridges, the landscaping along the shoulders. He also planned massive bridges, some spanning rivers, others crossing valleys, all designed to be larger and more impressive than anything built before. These bridges weren't just functional, they were statements, declarations that Germany could reshape the landscape itself, that no natural obstacle was too great, no challenge too daunting. And then there were the bunkers. As the war progressed and Allied bombing intensified, Hitler became obsessed with fortifications. Not the trenches and pillboxes of World War I, but massive reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand direct hits. The Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications along the French coast, became one of his fixations. He demanded thicker walls, deeper bunkers, more guns. Even here, in structures designed for war, Hitler insisted on aesthetic considerations. Bunkers should be imposing, intimidating, built to outlast the conflict and stand as ruins if necessary, testifying to German engineering prowess. He genuinely believed that even if Germany lost the war, these structures would remain, and future generations would look upon them with awe, recognizing the ambition and skill of their builders. It was a bizarre form of optimism, planning for defeat while still believing in immortality through architecture. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Hitler's architectural obsession was his concern for ruins. He developed what Albert Speer called the theory of ruin value. Hitler insisted that buildings should be designed with their eventual decay in mind. When they inevitably crumbled, they should still look impressive, like Greek temples or Roman aqueducts. Modern materials like steel and concrete, he argued, rusted and crumbled into ugly messes. Stone, granite, marble. These aged gracefully. So Hitler demanded that his buildings be constructed primarily from stone, even though it was more expensive and time-consuming. He wanted future archaeologists to uncover his monuments and recognize them as the work of a great civilization. He imagined tourists 1,000 years hence wandering through the ruins of Germania, marvelling at the scale, the craftsmanship, the ambition. It didn't matter if the Reich fell. The buildings would endure, and through them, his legacy. This obsession with permanence revealed a deep fear of being forgotten. Hitler understood that empires rise and fall, that political movements fade, that even the most powerful rulers are eventually reduced to footnotes. But buildings could outlast everything. And if his buildings stood long enough, if they dominated landscapes and inspired awe, maybe his name would survive. Not in history books, which could be rewritten, but in stone, which could not. Yet for all his planning, for all his obsession, most of Hitler's architectural dreams remained unrealized. The war consumed resources, labour shortages intensified, Allied bombing destroyed what little had been built. And as Germany's fortunes darkened, as defeat loomed, the fantasy of architectural immortality became harder to sustain. But Hitler never gave up. Even in the final months, even as Berlin burned, he continued discussing rebuilding plans with Speer. He spoke of post-war reconstruction, of resuming the Germania project, of completing the Volkshalle. Speer, by then focused on keeping Germany's collapsing infrastructure functional, humoured him, nodding along while privately understanding that none of it would ever happen. In the end, Hitler's architectural ambitions left behind only fragments. A few completed buildings, some half-finished monuments, and thousands of blueprints gathering dust in archives. The grand vision, the transformed Germany, the eternal stone empire, none of it materialized. What remained were ruins. Not the noble, impressive ruins Hitler had imagined, but the shattered, ugly remnants of hubris and delusion. And yet, even in their absence, these plans tell us something essential about the man, that his deepest desires weren't conquest or genocide, though he pursued both with monstrous efficiency. His deepest desire was to be remembered, to prove that his vision mattered, to carve his name into the landscape so deeply it could never be erased. He failed, but the obsession never left him, burning quietly until the very end. As World War II ground toward its catastrophic conclusion, as cities burned and armies collapsed, Adolf Hitler retreated into a world increasingly detached from reality. Above ground, Berlin was being pulverized by Allied bombs and Soviet artillery. Below, in the Führer bunker, a cramped, claustrophobic concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler clung to the one dream that had never abandoned him: architecture. The bunker was a grim, airless place. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, the constant hum of ventilation systems struggling to filter out smoke and dust. The walls sweated condensation. The air smelled of mildew, sweat, and despair. Hitler's health was failing. His hands trembled. His gait was unsteady. He looked decades older than his 56 years. Yet even here, even now, he spoke of buildings. Albert Speer, who visited the bunker in its final days, later described these conversations with a mixture of pity and horror. Hitler would unroll blueprints on a small table, his shaking hands smoothing the yellowed paper, his eyes lighting up as he pointed to the Volkshalle, the grand boulevard, the triumphal arch. He spoke as if construction would resume next week, as if the war were a temporary inconvenience, as if Germania were still inevitable. Speer tried to humour him, but it was unbearable. Outside, the Third Reich was collapsing. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Yet Hitler seemed more concerned about column spacing, in a building that would never be built, than about the soldiers dying to defend a regime that no longer existed. It was madness, a retreat into fantasy so complete that reality could no longer penetrate. But for Hitler, this wasn't madness. It was survival. Architecture had always been his refuge, the place he escaped to when the world disappointed him. As a homeless youth in Vienna, he sketched buildings to forget his hunger. As a frustrated politician, he designed monuments to channel his ambition. And now, as his empire burned, he returned to those same blueprints, those same dreams, because they were the only part of his life that still made sense. In his final days, Hitler dictated his will. Much of it was predictable, naming successors, blaming Jews for Germany's defeat, justifying his actions. But he also included instructions for his funeral, and, bizarrely, for future architecture. He insisted that his body be cremated, that no monument mark his grave, that no shrine be built to his memory. Yet in the same breath, he spoke of rebuilding, of a future Germany rising from the ashes grander than before. It was a contradiction, a man terrified of being forgotten, yet refusing to leave behind anything permanent. Perhaps he finally understood that his buildings, if they had been completed, would not have immortalized him. They would have become targets, symbols of tyranny that future generations would tear down with glee. Better to leave nothing than to leave monuments that would be destroyed. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler committed suicide. His body was burned in a shell crater outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and left to smoulder. There was no monument, no tomb, no architectural legacy. Just ashes scattered by the wind and buried under rubble. And what of his buildings? The few structures completed under his regime met varied fates. The new Reich Chancellery was obliterated by Soviet forces, its marble stripped and shipped to Moscow, its ruins bulldozed into oblivion. The Zeppelinfeld in Nuremberg was left to decay, its grandstands crumbling, its stones reclaimed by weeds. The unfinished Congress Hall became a storage facility, then a documentation centre, repurposed to educate visitors about the horrors of the regime that built it. Germania, the city that was supposed to define an era, never existed beyond models and blueprints. The Grand Boulevard was never paved. The Volkshalle was never constructed. The triumphal arch remained a sketch on yellowed paper. All that remained were scars, empty lots where buildings had been demolished in preparation for construction that never came. Foundations laid but never built upon. A city planned but never born. Albert Speer, who survived the war and stood trial at Nuremberg, spent 20 years in prison. He wrote memoirs claiming ignorance of the Holocaust, insisting he focused only on architecture, not politics. History judged him harshly, recognizing that architecture under the Nazis was never neutral, that every monument built required slave labour, that every grand design served propaganda. But Speer also wrote extensively about Hitler's architectural obsession, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost. He described Hitler as a man who, in another life, might have been a successful architect, perhaps even a great one. He had vision, he had passion, he had an eye for scale and proportion. But he also had megalomania, cruelty, and an utter disregard for human suffering. and those qualities poisoned everything he touched, turning dreams of eternal beauty into monuments of horror. In the decades since, historians and architects have studied Hitler's plans, not to admire them, but to understand them, to decode what they reveal about power, ideology, and the weaponization of aesthetics. The blueprints are displayed in museums, not as inspiration but as warnings. The models are preserved, not as art but as evidence. And the ruins that remain, the crumbling rally grounds, the empty foundations, stand as reminders that ambition without morality produces only emptiness. Some have argued that Hitler's architectural obsession was a distraction, that if he had focused more on military strategy or governance, the war might have unfolded differently. Others suggest the obsession was revealing, that it exposed his fundamental disconnect from reality, his belief that aesthetics could replace substance, that monuments could outlast truth. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Hitler's architectural dreams is how deeply personal they were. This wasn't a politician pandering to public taste, or a dictator pursuing vanity projects. This was a man trying to prove something to himself, to silence the voice that whispered he was a failure, that he had been right to dream of grandeur as a boy in Linz, that his vision deserved to reshape the world. He failed. The buildings never rose. The empire collapsed. The name that was supposed to echo through eternity became synonymous with evil. And yet the obsession itself, that desperate, consuming need to build, to create, to leave something behind, that obsession was perhaps the most human thing about him. Twisted, yes. Destructive, absolutely, but human. In the end, Adolf Hitler's greatest architectural achievement was the Führerbunker, a small, ugly, claustrophobic tomb buried beneath the rubble of Berlin. It wasn't grand, it wasn't beautiful, it wasn't eternal. It was the opposite of everything he dreamed, and it was where his story ended, surrounded not by marble columns and soaring domes, but by concrete walls and the smell of decay. The man who wanted to build forever died in a hole in the ground, and perhaps there's a lesson in that no amount of stone or steel can build a legacy if the foundation is rotten, that monuments crumble, but truth endures, that in the end we're remembered not for what we build, but for what we destroy. And Adolf Hitler, for all his sketches and blueprints and dreams of eternal cities, built nothing that lasted, nothing but ruins, nothing but ghosts. Nothing but a warning, carved not in marble but in memory, reminding us that obsession, no matter how grand, can never outrun its own emptiness.